Alright, I think it's time to move on to the next aphorism. Aphorism 219. Moral judgments and condemnations constitute the favorite revenge of the spiritually limited against those less limited. Also a sort of compensation for having been ill-favored by nature. Jesus Christ. Finally, an opportunity for acquiring spirit and becoming refined. Malice spiritualized. It pleases them deep down in their hearts that there are standards before which those overflowing with the wealth and privileges of the Spirit are their equals. They fight for the equality of all men before God, and almost need faith in God just for that. They include the most vigorous foes of atheism. Anyone who said to them, high spirituality is incomparable with any kind of solidity and respectability of a merely moral man, would enrage them. And I shall beware of doing this. Rather, I want to flatter them with my proposition that high spirituality itself exists only as the ultimate nature of moral qualities. That it is a synthesis of all those states which are attributed to merely moral men after they have been acquired singly through long discipline and exercise, perhaps through whole chains of generations. That high spirituality is a spiritualization of justice, and of that gracious severity which knows that it is its mission to maintain the order of rank in the world, among things themselves and not only among men.
So there's a lot there.
Yeah.
I'm probably going to need you to reread that. But
like the whole thing?
Yeah.
Okay.
But first, let's say a couple things.
Okay.
So Nietzsche at various points invokes some form of Darwinism to talk about cultural development, right? And
but he hates Darwin.
He doesn't hate Darwin. He hates scientific ideology, more or less. But it's unclear how seriously he does so at any point. Like, he certainly views man as a biological organism a lot. And that our attempts at figuring out things like the divine will are just kind of funny when you think about it like that. But, like, so okay, in a different one of his books, in The Gay Science, he talks about how how things like look, you know, we say like survival of the fittest and social Darwinism, but if you really and so this is why we have to like breed out, you know, like eugenics, like this is why we have to breed out stupid people, basically. And Nietzsche's like, look, if you really believed in Darwinism, then you would realize that if something was really harmful to the human race, it would have already died out. So all these things that you're trying to get rid of are actually beneficial in some way that you can't see. And so it's like playing with this Darwinistic, like so the social Darwinism belief. It's not necessarily affirming it.
Okay.
But of course, for Nietzsche, it's like a fine line. Like it's hard to tell when he's agreeing with something and when he's just suggesting it as a parody of something else, and he does that on purpose. So, with all that in mind, can you reread the section?
All right. Moral judgments and condemnations constitute the favorite revenge of the spiritually limited against those less limited. Also a sort of compensation for having been ill-favored by nature. Finally, an opportunity for acquiring spirit and becoming refined. Malice spiritualized. It pleases them deep down in their hearts that there are standards before which those overflowing with the wealth and privileges of the Spirit are their equals. They fight for the equality of all men before God, and almost need faith in God just for that. They include the most vigorous foes of atheism. Anyone who said to them, high spirituality is incomparable with any kind of solidity and respectability of a merely moral man, would enrage them. And I shall be aware of doing this. Rather, I want to flatter them with my proposition that high spirituality itself exists only as the ultimate product of moral qualities. That it is a synthesis of all those states which are attributed to merely moral men. After they have been acquired singly through long discipline and exercise, perhaps through whole chains of generations, that high spirituality is a spiritualization of justice and of that gracious severity which knows that it is its mission to maintain the order of rank in the world, among things themselves and not only among men?
Yeah, so I mentioned before the genealogy of... Or no, I haven't mentioned the genealogy of morals, but we talked about how Nietzsche views values as cultural devices. Um, and this is elaborated in one of his books called The Genealogy of Morals. But he thinks that underneath moral codes that are treated as absolute, often by religions, there is the latent desire, or like the cultural need, to maintain some sort of social order. So, like, look, Christianity needs to, so he thought that one of the reasons that Christian morality took off was that Christians were originally slaves, right, in the Roman Empire, and so what did they do? This might be Jews, I don't know, but you'll get the point.
Mm-hmm.
That this one group was slaves, so what did they do? They created a moral system which prizes slaves over masters, and this was a way of justifying their position in the world and giving them something higher to aspire to after their death. Even though they have no freedom now, they'll have absolute freedom in a life after. And really, they're the winners. It's not the more powerful Romans that are the winners, but it's them. They're the winners because they know what's going to happen later and the Romans don't. And that it serves this purpose, the religious code. And so that's one of the things that's going on at the end when he's talking about justice and how spirituality serves to withhold to hold up the existing order. That's what he's getting at. But now he's also in the beginning pointing out this contradiction between, look, on the one hand, you have this group of people that is willing to denounce anyone who does anything that's not in accord with their religious dictates, right? So someone who dares to say that God doesn't exist, or dares to be gay or something, they're the quickest to denounce these people as immoral and monstrous and corrupting and whatnot. But then at the same time will uphold, oh look, we're all children of God and everybody's equal and etc. And there's a contradiction there. And if it's not a hard contradiction, it's a psychological contradiction, which is further expounded by the idea that the latter proposition, the one that says, look, really everybody's equal in the eyes of God, and we're all equally moral and good, that allows them to think themselves on par with their great moral heroes, right? So it's on the one hand, you can denounce atheists as being corruptors, but then on the other hand, you can think that you're just as good as, Gandhi or something, because we're all built in the eyes of God, and he creates us all equal, and etc. So Nietzsche's pointing out all of that contradiction, that, not hard logical contradiction, but contradictory psychological beliefs that pop up. And then at the same time saying, look, all of this stuff basically just holds up the cultural, the place of people in society. And so he words it he's like, look, I'll word it as a compliment. But that's what he's saying, I think.
Yeah, so, we're going to be upfront, with everybody that's listening, because we don't want to, be accused of something later. I'm going to use a word that Dawkins, what's his first name?
Richard Dawkins.
I'm going to use a phrase that Richard Dawkins uses disparagingly, but I think represents my religious views pretty well. I'm a teapot agnostic, and that is a reference to Russell's teapot, which is a refutation of the ontological argument.
Just arguments for God. It's the idea is that. Do you want to explain?
Well, can you explain what it's specifically a refutation of the ontological argument, though, right?
I forget how it appeared originally. I've read the book. It very well could be.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you explain what the ontological argument is? Because I can explain what Russell's teapot is.
The best way would be to Google it, because it can get complicated. But the idea is that, look, it's a premised argument. Premise 1, God is the greatest conceivable being, right?
Mm-hmm.
Premise 2, and of course everyone's like, yeah, God's the greatest conceivable being, sure.
Right.
Premise 2, it's greater to exist than not to exist. Because look, if God, if anything, if I don't exist, then I can't do any good. But if I do exist, then I can do some good. So of course it's greater to exist than not to exist, right? So you agree with both the premises, and that being, and it's greater to exist and not to exist. Conclusion.
Right. Russell counters this with the notion that I can imagine this teapot. How's it go specifically, Robbie? Martin?
It's fine. Try to keep it to Martin. No, no. The Russell example is basically like, look, I can postulate something for you right now that you couldn't disprove.
Right.
It's look, I think it's Jupiter. There's a teapot orbiting Jupiter right now. You know, and then you might ask me like, oh, well, how do you know there's a teapot orbiting Jupiter? Why would a teapot be there? That's pretty strange, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just double down and say, look, no, you don't understand. You can't disprove there's a teapot.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a teapot.
Right.
And he thinks that this parallels the arguments for God, particularly like in the ontological argument. No, like you don't say anything about the world in postulating that there's a God. You just say a bunch of things about words. Like God's the greatest conceivable being sounds like a definition.
Mm-hmm.
It's greater to exist than not to exist. Also sounds like a definitional thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then you end up with something about the world. And what Russell says is like all the interesting questions are going to be the ones like how did it get there?
Right.
And that's strange. Why is that the case?
Mm-hmm.
And it's those things that you're going to have to show.
Right. Anyways, Richard Dawkins uses the phrase teapot agnostic in reference to that particular thought experiment to disparage agnostics who essentially say that they don't believe in God, but because they can't disprove it, they aren't comfortable calling themselves an atheist. They aren't comfortable claiming that knowledge. But that's just absolutely what I am. Someone who does not believe in God, but is not going to say for certain that he doesn't exist. Martin is an atheist.
I am an atheist, but I'm not like a Richard Dawkins atheist.
Right, no. We're like understanding, like, intersectional atheists.
Yeah, no, like, personally I don't believe in God, but I think that the things that the new atheists say are just kind of ridiculous.
Yes, they're awful. They're horrible.
And you end up with people like Sam Harris that just want to, like, I don't know.
Nuke the Middle East.
Yeah.
That's something he said before.
Well, I mean, yeah, Christopher Hitchens was a raging Islamophobe.
Yeah. And I think that all of that's bullshit and not really related to atheism in any way.
Yeah.
And so,
and of course, I'm like, some of my favorite authors of all time are very devout believers.
Mm-hmm. Like who would be one?
William James is one. He wrote a big essay, The Will to Believe. That's famous and has been referred to before. And I really like his work. And they're, devout believer, still live. Protestant.
That is Victor Novikov.
No, I don't think it matters.
And ringleader
Um,
of Iago. Quite
All right, and I brought that up because, like, obviously, Nietzsche is a sensitive subject when it comes to religion. And we want to make sure that you understand that we're attempting to, like, discuss these issues as even-handedly and respectfully as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the way that we view, like, we have to remember, like, Nietzsche does not like religion.
No, he doesn't.
But
Nietzsche is very against religion.
Yeah. But the way that we, he's a little bit even-handed with. I mean, he thinks that once religion is gone and we don't believe in God anymore, there's all these problems now that religion used to solve. Problems like where do our values come from, which we have to sit down and figure out now. So I mean, it's not like it's just happy fun times when we get rid of God for Nietzsche, but religion also presented itself to Nietzsche in a very different way than it does today. Like, we've had what we might call a very much of a liberalization of religion. Like, in Nietzsche's time, being devoutly religious was a much more serious thing that people did, and the church still had political power in a much bigger way than it currently does. And it just presented itself to him in vastly different ways than it does to us. So it's hard for us to put ourselves in the mindset of him.